Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. It's November 6th. My name is Olha Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to see everyone who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. It's been 10 years of the war, and today's day 621 of the full-scale invasion over homeland by Russian aggressor. And traditionally, I want to thank the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world the truth about a heroic resistance. Today, we have invited you for a presentation of an interesting research by VoxCheck. We will be talking about Russian propaganda and Russian propaganda spread in Europe. I think it's no news to anybody that one of the important components of this propaganda are the fakes about Ukraine. So today we will be talking about this research. We will discuss its results. And I want to introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Myroslava Markova, VoxCheck senior analyst, Anayit Khoperiya, head of the Department for Countering Information Threats to National Security at the Center for Countering Misinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Ihor Solovey, head of the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security, and joining us online is Dmytro Tuzhanskyi, director of the Institute for Central European Strategy. Good morning, everybody. Myroslava, I would like to give the floor to you. A couple of words about the methods of this research and its results. Good morning. Thanks everybody for attention to this topic and to work of VoxCheck. We are ready to present our results within the last year. VoxCheck is the fact-checking project. We are a part of Pointer IFC and Institute International Fact-Checker Community since 2018, and we are partners in Meta fact-checking program in Ukraine, so we have access to monitoring and debunking of misinformation emerging in such platforms as Facebook and Instagram or spreading over there from other platforms. And at least since 2021, VoxCheck is monitoring and debunking Russian misinformation about Ukraine that emerges in Ukrainian media space as well as in Russian and European. So let me start with the propaganda diary, a project that we started in the end of year 2021, and in May 22 we were able to present the first version of that base that represented back then the monitoring of the media of two countries, Italy and Germany. Before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they were the top targets of Russian propaganda. Germany, as per the results of the monitoring of fact-checkers from all around the world, and Italy piqued our interest by the fact that during the peaks of COVID-19, Russia used that time to enter the media space of Italy as a savior. And it was interesting for us to see what was the sentiment building up over there about Ukraine. And in 2022, the propaganda went to the levels that were never achieved before, specifically in Europe. And we decided to spread this monitoring to the media of 6 countries: Germany, Italy, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Czech Republic. So why it's important? A couple of words about the goal. We're talking about the fight of Ukraine for the support, for funds, for support with the arms. So we have to understand what people talk about Ukraine in the world. But Russia orients on the sentiment of every specific country in Ukraine. But before we decide what counter-narratives would work against them, we need to understand what other narratives working against Ukraine in Europe. So a couple of words about the structure of the base. The base contains thousands of fake messages documented in media of 6 countries, but to structure them we identified 27 fake narratives, and to structure them we divided the base into misinformation cases, fakes, and narratives. A case is a specific message, specific video, specific news on the media, and they got united into fakes, and fakes are the examples of a specific message that the propaganda is trying to communicate, just like narratives. So we've segregated 27 narratives that were actively pushed and promoted in those countries, and one of the biggest ones is, for example, the West controls Ukraine and uses it. One of the fakes within this narrative says that the West forces Ukraine to refuse peace negotiations and to fight until the very last Ukrainians. And right in front of you are the examples of misinformation cases that we were able to collect in every specific country. Or, for example, another narrative. As Russia asserts Ukraine is a terrorist state, we've heard it a lot of times in different news. We've segregated this, or we've divided this news into a number of fakes, like, for example, Ukraine is behind the detonation of Kakhovka Dam. And every message will be a specific case of such misinformation. What's also interesting about this database, a database may be of help for both Ukrainians who study propaganda against Ukraine in Europe and for journalists, fact-checkers in every specific countries, specifically from that point of view that we've made a list of black and white media, the media who communicate information on a professional basis, and the black ones who were spotted to spread information, misinformation and propaganda against Ukraine. And also on a monthly basis we publish trends for every country. Here you can see the spreading of trends of misinformation spreading in Poland. We are only preparing the list for the last month, for October, and the way you can see it is very convenient to visualize for everybody who is curious about this topic. On top of that, the database itself is available in 9 languages, 6 languages of the countries that I've mentioned, plus Ukrainian, Russian and English, plus the whole database can be downloaded from the website. It's in the format of the table of a chart that can be used in a number of ways. On top of that, another useful tool, we call it the fake dynamics. There is a comparison for 22 and 23, and you can see the most popular messages for every month. If you're curious about some specific topic like Ukraine is a terrorist state, you can check out the month during which this news was the most popular. Then we can proceed to the trends itself. What was different comparing to the year 22, for example, apart from intensifying the number of amount of misinformation? Since February 2022, we identified more than 1,000 cases of Russian propaganda in the media of those countries. If we divide it by the month, it will be more than 900 publications per month. Also, within the same period of 23, we've identified more than 5,000 cases. If we divided them by month, it was about 400 cases of propaganda. And thus we see that the trend of intensification is almost the double multiplication. However, regardless of the fact that propaganda is an obvious thing for us, it may be surprising sometimes. Also, we've added 43 new fakes, mostly related to the topic of counteroffensive and miscreating of Ukrainian armed forces, as if Ukrainian armed forces turned themselves in as prisoners of war, they surrender, then that mobilization is contrary to the Ukrainian legislation, and more facts about the handover of Western weapons to Ukraine. But let's check out the quantity indicators. In years 22 and 23, the biggest number of cases was documented in Polish media. We can speculate about why this country is a target, but we think that is because Poland received the biggest number of Ukrainian refugees who were fleeing the war. And also there's a lot of manipulations to sow the seeds of bad sentiment about Ukrainians in Poland. And one of the top news is the lack of resources for proper social support of the Polish due to all of the funds spent for Ukrainians. Then the Russian media tried to depict Ukrainians as an evil force who has no respect to the Polish who receive them so warmly. Also, a lot of facts are aimed to emphasize that the support of Ukraine is vain, that the defeat of Ukraine is already predictable, and all of the resources that you provide, they just vanish. Also, we see that in year 2022, the second targeted country was Hungary, third is Czech Republic, then in 23, Hungary is the fourth place, then Germany, and then Italy. Well, talking about the general tendencies, there are three narratives in the top that we were able to identify in 2022, and they just get more and more layered and added with more fraudulent or fake news. The first one is that the West controls Ukraine, and now that the truth negotiations are being discussed, as if Russia comes up with a number of suggestions about the truth negotiations, and the Ukrainian party refuses it along with the West. Then another news is that the support of Ukraine is harmful to the West more than to Russia. Here we're talking about all of the news about the articles of spending for Ukraine, how harmful it is, and they claim that every country who handed over any help to Ukraine, such help was of harm to those countries. And it's like some war that they cannot see. It's very distant, very far away from them, and some stories that they, for example, could spend more for the healthcare system is something that finds some satisfaction among the Europeans. So it's a very dangerous narrative. Basic narratives remain the same, but in reality they only intensify the propaganda, because the more intense we repeat the same message in different forms, in different formats, in different materials, the better it is perceived. So if we say that the key narratives remain unchanged, it's not a failure of Russian propaganda. It's maybe small, but a victory. Another trend is that the old fakes do not change, and they just only get added with the new fakes. Previously, they were writing that the weapons sent to Ukraine are being resold in the black market. So now this narrative has changed to that Ukrainian military are not going to be able to master those weapons, so they're inefficient, and thus the money spent for that are spent in vain. Then another message is that only 30% of the weapons have come to Ukraine, and the rest is sold around the criminal circles in Europe or else. And the most dangerous trend is about the war between Israel and Hamas, as if Ukraine has resold the European and American weapons to Hamas. Also, in some of the East European countries, it resulted in support of the Russian narratives by local politicians. It intensified in Poland before the elections, and even now, if we talk about the quality of media from the whitelist, more and more media in European countries are about to publish more of Russian fakes because they aspire to quoting their popular politicians. In Slovakia, currently, there is a lot of psyops and forecasts from Western pseudo-experts about Russian pending counteroffensive and capturing of Kharkiv and Odessa, and it creates an image as if Russia is in offensive and they are about to defeat Ukraine shortly. Then Slovakian media quote newly elected Prime Minister Fico, who in 2015 quoted Russian fakes about Nazis in Ukraine. Also, there are fakes about handover of ATACMS missiles and future supply, about Ukrainians unable to master F-16, and so on and so forth. In Germany, a number of cases intensified in a very illustrative manner, and the main fakes are about failure of counteroffensive, the season of support of Ukraine, that Ukraine spent all of the Western weapons during counteroffensive, which deemed ineffective. On top of that, Israel and Hamas has taken a lot of attention in every of the mentioned countries, and it demonstrates how Russia can use any other information to draw attention away from Russian war in Ukraine. And there is also an intense lobby in Germany of the news that the West and Ukraine refuses the truth communications. In Italy, the trends are quite similar to Germany. All of the attention is on Israel. And there is also justification in the Italian media of Russian war crimes. We can see narratives about the fact that Russian aggression was justified, that Ukraine provoked it. And if there are comments of Italian authorities, they say that they are under the influence of Western propaganda and that the Italian government is confused. However, at the same time, they stopped writing about Ukrainian refugees in Italy. In Hungary, they quote the statement of Orban about the necessity to lift sanctions. They promote Putin's statements about the truth, and the key focus topic is the oppression of Hungarians in Ukraine, plus a lot of fakes about Western weapons. In Czech Republic, there was an intense campaign on discreditation of Zelensky, and now those messages even intensified. On a weekly basis, we document a number of cases about the foreign mercenaries in Ukraine and a narrative about foreign military fighting in Ukraine. It's like an involvement of other countries in the conflict. In Poland, the propaganda is spread about United States stopping their support of Ukraine and switching their focus on Israel. Also, the news is spread about the sanctions that are of no harm to Russia or of harm to Europe. Also, on top of those problems, they say that Polish should not spend resources on Ukrainian refugees. One of such sub-narratives that we identified is that Ukrainian refugees do not fall under Geneva Convention, and it's unclear what do those people do in the country of Poland and why the Polish should spend money of them. Also, they promoted the topic of grain, that contrary to the agreements, Ukraine supplies the grain not to the southern countries but to Europe, thus demonstrating itself as an unreliable partner. And to sum it up, when we say that some narratives get repeated, they build an ecosystem, a whole history of what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. Because what Russia does in its state media, relying upon previous fabricated stories and quoting and requoting them, sometimes in their marginal and pro-Russian media, they build this system of a cross-referencing, and they build the whole story why such narrative is definitely faithful and why it cannot be debunked. Here you go, here's thousands of publications why Ukraine is a terrorist state, why they do not comply with its agreements, grain deal, and so on and so forth. So the summary is that repetition is one of the achievements of propaganda and not our victory. It's in the intensification of some ideas, planted them in the society in some specific country. Thank you, Myroslava. Thank you for this interest in research. We just cannot help but worry about it. Miss Anayit, let's proceed to the next trend, the intensification of the fakes, like twice since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. They were more blunt. For us, they were even sometimes funny because it was done in some peculiar manner, so to say. Now we see this propaganda transform, we see the narratives evolving, becoming more weighed and balanced, and they really target European audience as well as ours. So what do you observe? What should we do about it? Do we have any tools to counter those narratives? Thank you. So about the first question, we can say that in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russian propaganda was completely focused on our country. This is why we were experiencing this huge intensity of information attacks. Now they focus their attention on the West. They use our vulnerabilities to somehow destabilize our country internally. But we see, as Myroslava mentioned, there is a huge intensity in terms of focus on West. We also monitor the information space of Western countries, well, all of the foreign countries abroad, anything that is related to Ukraine. And on top of narratives, we see people, the experts, the journalists, or so-called journalists, who continue repeating the Russian narratives. And in coordination with VoxCheck in our new YouTube channels, we discuss all those people specifically, so please watch who's spreading that propaganda on our YouTube. Also, what we do, we monitor specific countries, we provide infographics in our social media. The last one was Belgium, for example, and over there the Russians, they did not use any unique content. They just use the diplomatic websites, the websites of the embassies, to spread the narratives they need. Since we were checking out Belgium the last, so this is what they state. Belgium became a part of the war waged by the West in Ukraine. Ukraine violates the rights of Russian-speaking population. Ukraine uses the Belgian weapons for sabotage actions in the border with Russia, and Ukraine is a marionette of NATO. What we do, how do we counter that propaganda? How do we do it? We do weekly reports. We highlight what's going on in our information space. What are the narratives being spread within a week? The incidents, fakes, manipulations, misinformation, the examples. And we also have a number of Russian narratives spread in foreign media. For example, last week we identified a number of narratives which are constantly repeated, that Ukrainian armed forces are incompetent and weak. The West is tired with Ukraine. The West is running out of time and money. And we published the list of media resources which spread such fakes. And in the end of our report, we submit recommendations about counter-narratives that can be used in our communication. We also translate that weekly report for our foreign partners. We mean the government institutions which counter misinformation abroad. They are obviously curious to see what's going on in Ukrainian information space, and this small section about the narratives spread by the foreign media is also something of interest to them. We also hand over the list of people whom we deem as those who repeat Russian narratives. They reside in those foreign countries, and this is why we hand over that information to the governments of those countries. Like, for example, in Ukraine, we can submit some information, some sanctions list to the Security Service of Ukraine, and roughly saying somehow even to block a YouTube channel, but abroad is their own business. Our task is to highlight the problem, to draw their attention to it, and talking about the trends that we see, any stories of success. For example, every time our first lady goes somewhere, she buys somewhere, then she had a shopping worth of couple $1 million. It started with France, where she bought a Louis Vuitton, and those journalists, politologists, they posted that information regardless of the fact it was a total fake. And every time Mrs. Zelenska goes anywhere, the same information repeats. And the first source was Nigerian. They started publishing that information. First it was a fake about First Lady's mother buying a villa in Egypt, and thanks to our quick monitoring and the coordinated actions of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, those news spread abroad without spreading in Ukraine, and then we were able to mitigate it. And then it turned out so that in New York, the First Lady bought Cartier Cartier jewelry worth of millions of dollars, as if a Cartier employee posted that video online and got fired for it. Here's the receipt that she bought it, and it said like that this is how Ukraine spreads the money provided by the partners. But there is a date on the receipt, and the date says that the First Lady was in Canada on that date. Well, we get surprised by those fakes, but on the other hand, apart from those narratives that Ms. Myroslava mentioned, they use the narrative that Ukraine is an unreliable partner and is a corrupt state. So those small stories, they continue promoting those narratives, and our task, apart from attempts to repel those attacks, figuring out some ideas of our counter propaganda, counter narratives, we realized that we should continue creating narratives, strategic narratives, positive narratives about Ukraine having the same values that the European Union, NATO countries. We are a democratic country. We want to become part of them because we deserve it. Also that Ukraine is resistant. And this is something nobody can argue. I mean, at least democratic countries, I've never seen them argue about that. And basically, we have to continue proving, unfortunately, that it was Russia who invaded our country. I'm sorry, I'm kind of thinking in English that it's Russia's fault, not Ukraine. So, apart from us doing our job, I think Mr. Ihor is about to tell us more details from the perspective of the government institutions. We counter all of the information attacks in a coordinated manner. We do everything to make sure that our partner countries are not disappointed, to make sure that they see what's really going on. So we have those strategic narratives about us deserving to be a part of European Union and NATO. We have to continue communicating it, and thanks to the work of VoxCheck and other public organizations, civil organizations, journalists, we see what's going on abroad and we mitigate those narratives. They will continue being intense always. We're not gonna get away from it, and it's our task to repel those attacks. The Schindler Institutes are going to continue existing. The journalists will continue existing who will use any narratives against us. We need to create the pool of ours, but not in a way that Russia does it, but roughly saying to prove that we are a reliable democratic country, reliable partner, and they can judge us based upon our actions. Before we proceed to Mr. Ihor, just a small question to you. You've mentioned that those narratives are being created. We understand that there is a fight against them into tracks, legal and communications way. So as we win on the legal way, we may lose on the communications way. So what do we do? What communication methods do we use to overcome that propaganda? Well, on behalf of my organization, I can say that we use all of the communications platforms possible that are available abroad. If we use MFA instruments like our embassies, people can go to the embassies and they post the information in their official media that debunks those fakes, that repels those misinformation attacks. Also, if we ask the special services, we use their closed channels, or we can use our communications channels. We have Twitter, we have English language version of Telegram, and weekly reports that we send to 65 recipients who are interested in that. And in communication with our foreign partners, they express interest to make some projects to improve the media literacy, to counter misinformation, and as we discuss the details, we give the examples of our country. The way that Russia develops their propaganda in Ukraine, and in other countries they can see that apart from them becoming more media literate, they see our examples and they see that all of our countries are affected by Russian misinformation campaigns. Mr. Ihor, let's talk about counter narratives. What works, what else can work, and what are the ways to spread that information? In your opinion, what works well or what could work well to intensify, to reinforce us? Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank our partners and friends from VoxCheck for this great study. Your studies are always very practical to be used in everyday work. And talking about the essence of this study, I'm not going to stop on the specific narratives that we see as well. They're very well illustrated in your research work, but the goal of information work of the Russians always boils down to two tasks. First, it was the discreditation of Ukraine to reduce the support of our country with weapons, with funds, in a humanitarian aspect. So now what's added, another task, is to use the factor of Ukraine to reduce the support of democratic governments in different countries, thus changing the electoral picture in different countries. As we see on the example of Slovakia, now we see this course being implemented in other countries as well. So this is what's happening now. And what's going to happen next is that all of those narratives, first of all, about the weapons, about Ukraine being low-quality user, and the European or Western weapons disappearing in Ukraine and appearing on the terrorist side. Recently we had a case in Israel when Israeli TV used a blunt fake of Russian propaganda about Ukrainian weapons being resold to Hamas. So we've entered into communication with that Israeli channel and we try to have them debunk that information, having provided Ukrainian comments. So this trend will continue, but in addition to the main narratives that are used already, we forecast that there will be a wider spread, more widespread case of persecution of the church being promoted. We see it intensifying in the United States. Shortly it will spread over the European continent, and it's not only related to the events unfolding in Ukraine, but rather with the intensification of the network of lobbyists of Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. I guess they might have gotten another tranche for this activity, or they've just found somebody who is ready to do that for free. Another third narrative that we expect to intensify with the beginning of the negotiations on accession of Ukraine into the EU, we expect to see the growth of number of fakes and manipulations about the unreadiness of Ukraine to become a part of EU. So just like my colleagues identified that the number of fakes increased almost twice, I think it will increase maybe even thrice, because the topic of Ukraine is not a internally Ukrainian problem, it's a global problem. This number of manipulations, information attacks on Ukraine with the help and with the use of Ukrainian events, Ukrainian circumstances, it will only intensify, and our task is to get consolidated not only inside Ukraine but also to get consolidated with the partners and friends in Europe, USA, in the West to counter this information threat, because without the victory in the information front, victory over Russia is impossible. Thank you, Mr. Ihor. Mr. Dmytro, I hope you're with us. Please join our conversation. We would like to ask you, let's talk about how the population of Europe perceives those narratives. It's clear that those narratives are well perceived. We see the change of sentiment in some of the European countries. So what is the scale of this phenomena? We cannot hear you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me join this conversation. A very interesting research, and I would just like to add a couple of words plus about the public sentiment. Well, in the view of the research and daily monitoring of the narratives made by our institute, we were also participating in two other similar programs with the German program NOS within the last year and a half. And what we've seen that really Russian misinformation or propaganda is changing but on the other hand, it's not. So it depends on how and when they use those old narratives. And what I would like to emphasize is that one of the key tasks of the Russian misinformation from the point of view of the Western countries is to achieve the isolationism of those countries, to have that idea become mainstream, to make it a pacifist idea, to make it an elite idea. And it's not only anti-Ukrainian from the point of view, like don't help Ukraine, don't support it with weapons, and so on and so forth. Just be merciful, let's send the meals or medicines to Ukrainians. But also this idea of isolationism is of serious threat to European Union and NATO. This is something that undermines them from inside. And this is that connection that is not being realized abroad. The idea of isolationism that Russian propaganda continues feeding. So it didn't start in 2022 and not even in the year 2014. It's a challenge, a vision, a narrative, third way of what we see, something developing in Hungary, then we see Slovakia now. So this is something based on the internal challenges of European Union, NATO, internal challenges inside of those countries. The fight between open and closed society, conservative and liberal ideas. It matches those ideas of the West, and Russia plays on them. Another thing I would like to add, it just complements that research that you've made. It's the matter of manipulation and a very intense work with the expectations, bilateral expectations. I would like to share it with my colleagues. We communicate a lot with Mr. Ihor about this. We in Ukraine underperform, or maybe we don't have enough time, resources, maybe the perception of this moment that in countering Russian misinformation we have to pay a lot of attention to make sure that our expectations match with those of our partners, our allies, like Ukrainian expectations, to make them match with the expectations of Hungarian society, Slovakian society. You see those rifts that we observe. It's a matter of expectations and the way that Russia formulates those expectations. We have unprecedented examples when Russia breaks democracies, because the expectations most discussed, they are formulated from the set of lies, from misinformation. It's very difficult because, again, if we debunk the facts, if we debunk misinformation, we don't debunk the expectations because they are already there. No one remembers based on what were those expectations about the weapons or expectations about non-provision of weapons. So it's a very serious challenge in terms of countering misinformation because debunking the fakes with the statements is not going to work. And another important thing that we need to ponder over is that Russian misinformation plays very well. They strike directly on the level of sentiment. We were in Spain recently. It seems a very Western country. And in our reports, it shows up as a problematic country. We communicated with their media, and the level of immersion in Ukrainian context is huge. They are mostly left liberal media, but they discern very well Russian-speaking Ukrainians and pro-Russian Ukrainians. They say that there is no strict relation between those categories, but even the analysts, think tankers, journalists, they have a feeling of this peace, welfare, and continuation of war, continuing providing weapons to Ukraine. It's in contradiction with their sentiment, so we have to learn to work with that sentiment. It's one of the serious changes, and another related challenge is to leave the dead end, which is discussed in the context of Russian aggression of Ukraine. Like, okay, Russia occupied you, what now? Counteroffensive doesn't go as well as expected. And they're gonna say, well, it's not our wars. This is something that our officials say. So what is the way out of this situation? To continue the war? You know, the matter of playing on their feelings, on their sentiment, to make the way out of this dead end. And another thing that is also important in analysis of Russian misinformation, when we analyze how to counter it, we have to understand that Russians really work with the stories and they work with the synonyms. Ukraine is built by them as a country of corruption, unreliability, unreliable ally. So they build this chain that is very, very difficult to debunk, which very rarely has any real grounds but looks logical. So it looks logical for the public. And talking about public sentiment, it all depends on the specific moment, and now we're going through one of those difficult moments in terms of the Western support of the country on the level of public sentiment. This tiredness that we were afraid of last autumn, I think that it's finally here and it progresses. It requires specific analysis. I don't want to speculate here, but the people we were talking to, the economists in some relevant countries, like for example the Hungarians, their economic problems, their unreadiness to help Ukraine, they are very indirectly related with Russian invasion or war in Ukraine. The main problem is the populistic policy of the government within the last 2 years and blocking of European funds. So it's not the connection that their government builds. It's like, let's finish the war in Ukraine and then the economic situation is going to improve. This is why the Russians work very well with the public sentiment. And the last statement I would like to make is that even the biggest threat is in populistic isolationist regimes within the EU and NATO, which work even more thoroughly with the public sentiment and who build their rating on the conflict, on the rift in the society, on populism, and it's very clearly coincides with Russian propaganda, counter-Ukrainian, counter-American sentiment, and honestly, it becomes more and more difficult to discern Russian propaganda from propaganda or misinformation of some political forces inside EU and NATO. Thank you very much, Mr. Dmytro. We're running out of time quite quickly, dear friends. We suggest you to join our conversation. Ukraine Forum, during your presentation, you said you have the list of Western journalists who spread Russian narratives on a regular basis. Or can we somehow bring them to reputational liability for that? Well, look, we do this job, as I've mentioned before. We cannot say, like, pay attention to them, like, put them somewhere, lock them somewhere. It's impossible because we have our law in force. We have amendments to the criminal code made before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and now we are able to do at least something with that. Their policy is a little bit different. We are pro-freedom of speech, but we discern it when there is disruption of our country in general and when there is just statement of someone else's ideas. They pay attention to it, they ask for those lists, and they even bring up that issue of amendment to their legislation. It's a positive way for them, for our European partners, to blocking of RT and Sputnik is a huge breakthrough for their countries, and we will continue doing that in such a closed format we do it. But roughly saying, we cannot force anybody to do something. I just want to add a couple of words about a problem that we spot during monitoring as we study any country. For example, we document everything on a permanent basis, but we see that as soon as one channel is blocked, even no matter how many years it has taken to realize, they pop up just like the mushrooms, the new blogs, new platforms. Every time, YouTube blocks some Western speakers for spreading some fakes, and then they switch to other platforms which have more relaxed regulation. And those bloggers, for example, they get banned somewhere and their audience get inspired to find out that some alternative point of view is being banned. So, if a Russian state media is being punished, that there is a number of other speakers, other bloggers, whom you cannot bring to liability for direct connection to Russian government, but as you check them out, they use the cliches of Russian propaganda in their blogs. It's just word for word from Russian state media. But in that case, it's even more difficult or even impossible to do something. Just like Anayit has said, there are other views over there, and the attitude is more cautious to what is Russian misinformation and what is alternative point of view. So it's difficult to demonstrate sometimes that some websites from our list, they copy what Russian state media states. It's very difficult to establish any legal connection with Russian state media, to identify that they we're getting some funding from Russian media.
First off, let me tell you that there are Western journalists here to combat those folks that lie, and there are some that have actually violated criminal law when it comes to like John Mark Dugan and Graham Phillips participating in torture. My question, though, is do we have a way of assessing the return on the investment of the Russian disinformation campaigns? So what do they get back for the amount of time they have to invest? And we have two elections recently that gave us some indication. We have Slovakia and we have Poland. They give us a little bit of indication of how much data they poured in versus a result, even if we can't directly tie them. But do you take the time to look at this? Дякую.
Хто візьме? Прошу.
From our point of view, there is unsolved matter, you know, of the connection, like how to pick a political leader who will spread more messages of Russian propaganda, or how to grow an audience on the soil of Russian propaganda. But you know, the politicians in Western countries could not target something, could not play on some sentiment that would not have existed in that country. They specifically were picking those messages about the support of Ukraine to play on the sentiment of their societies. So there was a significant fraction of population who found support in those leaders. And I can only support the words of Myroslava, both in our country and in others. You see how successful they were playing on the side of specific politicians, disrupting us. And in the same way they do it in other countries. So if there is just a small opportunity, they cover everything with their Russian language, Russian country, Russian culture, and it comes to a pool of population who are pro-Russians. Probably it cannot be fully eradicated. I cannot see such an opportunity, because in democratic countries people should have access to any type of information, but to make it a cult like we are Russians, we are everywhere, and like in Baltic countries, for example, for me personally, it's a successful expression of their identity in Latvia, when that they can use Russian language abroad, but you cannot vote in the elections, and that's it. Period. Thank you, dear friends. Any more questions? Angelina Zavodetska, detector, can you please tell us why the amount of Russian propaganda is increasing, and what were the channels that you've noticed in different countries which intensify the spreading of Russian propaganda? Well, why is it increasing now? First of all, because when there were those electoral processes, it was a very fertile soil to throw in even more messages which were probably not direct propaganda, but which were consonant with Russian propaganda. This is why Slovakia came to the second spot in our rating this year. Ukraine is one of the top targets to destabilize, like many times the historic issues between Poland and Ukraine were discussed to push the partner away from us. And in other countries it was related to electoral processes and to the facts that when a list of our media, the number of media intensified almost twice from the last year. And then there is yet another trend, even if the information causes are not sufficient. You know, there is a number of experts with their interview about nothing, you know, to create some information costs just to write something about Ukraine in a way useful for Russia. And why is it intense? Why it's intensifying now, and if it's going to intensify, I think that it will, because Russian propaganda has to support certain level of interest. However, we've seen that gap related to Israel and Hamas when a lot of countries shifted their focus from Ukraine. But even during that time, the propagandists were drawing parallels that both Israel and Ukraine are Nazi states, that they hand over the weapons, they are unreliable partners, that everywhere the United States come to, the World War III starts, and Ukraine is being brought up in every of those cases. I'm absolutely agreeing on the issue of electoral processes. What I would like to add is about the main goals. My colleagues already have mentioned Poland, Slovakia, and according to our information, the Kremlin ordered their information troops to accumulate forces on the to target three countries, Germany, France, and Italy. So we expect to see the biggest number of information attacks in those countries, specifically in the information space of those countries. How do they work? Well, little has changed. First of all, is the social media, but the social media were added by the sources of the manipulative news. If before that they were just some specific people, some pseudo experts being interviewed, now they're being added by a segment of fake media. We've seen publications in American press about Russians with the use of Kremlin money and Kremlin companies, creating a very intense system of misinformation in Latin America. They create the clones of prominent media which generate blunt lies, which is being translated through social media with a reference to those to the traditional media, and sometimes traditional media, even reputed traditional media, get into that trap. So this practice works in the countries of Europe for a long time, so we have to be very cautious about the sources of the news. Russians use that fake media, they create them in European countries, and thus they translate or broadcast their messages. Another mechanism which is more related to active measures in the area of information operations, we've seen the publications recently when I don't remember a citizen of what country was arrested in France who were drawing the David Star on the buildings, and this information was spread by Kremlin information troops all over their resources. So thus we see that there will be a return to the old practice of creation of those information causes. And just a couple of words to add. I would like to thank Ihor for reminding me that's another thing that we've documented during our monitoring. So they were using those active measures in different countries, in Italy and in Germany at least. In different regions, there were as if mass protests, peace protests against handover of weapons to Ukraine. It was right before the announcement of any weapons to be handed over to Ukraine. They were making a photo as if it was a large event. There was the same thing in US. Anayit knows when hundreds of people were photographed at the stadiums as if the protests against United States inciting the war in Ukraine. And back in 20 during the first half of the year, there was no such number of those pseudo events to imitate the support of population, the huge support among the population of idea not to hand over the weapons to Ukraine. I want to thank everybody for this fundamental research. I want to thank you, dear friends, for the interest to this topic. I guess there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and the amount of this work only grows. So thank you very much for not ceasing your work in this area. We continue working together. Our next briefing is at 12 o'clock. We will be talking about the operations of our air defense forces. Stay tuned, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.